On the 5th of June 1967, the Middle East erupted into full-scale war once again. After threatening to annihilate Israel for several weeks, Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, had closed the Straits of Tiran in the Red Sea, itself an act of war, and ordered the UN peacekeeping force to leave the Sinai Peninsula. Israel responded with a preemptive strike, destroying almost the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Israel was now at war with both Egypt in the Sinai Desert and with Syria, which was bombarding the Galilee with shell fire from the Golan Heights. The Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, sent a message to King Hussein of Jordan asking him to stay out of the war. The Jordanians responded by bombarding Jerusalem from the surrounding areas, including from just over there behind me. Israel was now in a defensive war with Jordan as well. After 2 days of fighting on 3 fronts, on the 7th of June, the Israel Defense Forces liberated the old city of Jerusalem from Jordanian occupation.
This is Kol Yisrael, the voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Wednesday, June the 7th, 1967, 4:30 p.m. The military spokesman announces, this morning the Israel Defense Forces penetrated the old city of Jerusalem.
After taking the Temple Mount, the IDF troops descended to the Western Wall, the massive retaining wall dating back to the Temple era. On the orders of the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, the Islamic holy sites, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, were to be protected and preserved intact at all costs. Among those in the first IDF unit to arrive on the Temple Mount that day was the late Gershon Salomon.
And the Israeli forces entered through the Lion Gates and then through the tribes gates of the Temple Mount. We ran like, I would say, crazy people, if I can say it, to a place that we never saw in our life. And we stood before God in the location of the first and the second temple in a great moment. And we could do just one thing, to cry, to weep, like small kids. Short time before this, these soldiers were like lions, made the battle for the liberation of Jerusalem. After a long time that this holy place of Israel and God were in a long prison. And here we are, and we wept, and we cried, and we felt the presence of God, and we felt like a great historical circle, a prophetic circle, was closed in this moment.
And so the Jewish people were now back in their historic capital city, the walled old city of Jerusalem, from which they had been ethnically cleansed 19 years earlier. And the Western Wall behind me, which is the holiest site in Judaism, where they're able to pray without interference. The liberation of the old city of Jerusalem is a milestone which, controversially, is celebrated by Jewish people to this day.
Israel didn't initiate the Six-Day War in 1967. It was initiated by President Nasser when he closed the Suez Canal, when he closed the Straits of Aqaba, and when he came to an agreement with King Hussein of Jordan to attack Israel. And Israel defended itself. Now, this was an aggressive war. And international law acknowledges the fact that if you're faced with a war of aggression, you're entitled not only to defend yourself, but the outcome of the war has an element of legalization and justification. And during the course of defending itself against an aggressive war, again, it found itself entering the territories of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and entering the Gaza Strip.
There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the State of Israel existed as a matter of law and fact on the 14th of May 1948.
The mandate's statement that Palestine is the historic home of the Jewish people applies to the entire territory of the mandate, including Jerusalem and the West Bank.
In 1948, Israel, in declaring its independence, established itself as a legitimate state based upon Article 80. I have little doubt about that. The invasion by the other Arab states is clearly an act of aggression, which is contrary to the UN Charter.
Well, the bottom line is that Jordan had no rights to the territory that it seized illegally in a war of aggression. It compounded that illegality by committing further crimes against the local Jewish population. It ethnically cleansed the lands it occupied from Israel of all of its Jews. It destroyed synagogues, burnt books, desecrated graves. But its purported annexation of what then became known as the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem had no legitimacy in international law, and as such it was not generally recognised by the international community.
When Israel took back control after the Six-Day War, it was taking back control of territories which, as a matter of law, had already been part of the State of Israel. So it wasn't taking back control of Jordanian territory, it was taking back control of territory that legally belonged as part of the State of Israel. Because the fundamental question is, what were the borders of the State of Israel when it was created in May 1948?
The mandate is the last international authoritative determination of the boundaries of Israel. And the reason has to do with the way we figure out the boundaries of new countries in international law. So Israel was created in 1948. Most people agree to that. Israel came into existence in 1948. And the question is, what were its boundaries? At the moment of its birth, what were its dimensions? And international law has a widely used, or universally used, doctrine in international law determines the borders of new countries. This is a doctrine which is used in every single situation a new country is created, whether it be through the collapse of Spanish Empire in Latin America, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the breakup of Ethiopia and Eritrea. So the rule of international law, which has a fancy name, uti potestatis juris, basically says when a new country comes into being, its borders are the borders of the last top-level administrative unit in that area. So what's that mean?
Now, when Israel was created in 1948, the immediately prior administrative unit was the Mandate of Palestine. That's what Israel was created out of. And so Israel was the only state created out of what was left of the Mandate in 1948. And that means that it, according to this doctrine of uti possidetis juris, inherited those boundaries. The boundaries of the Mandate became the boundaries of Israel.
The analysis of international law on the status of the territory and the clear application of uti possidetis juris as the default rule of customary international law applies to any state. But in the case of Israel, you do also, of course, have the important historical, political and legal context of the recognition at San Remo and in the Mandate of the right of the Jewish people to reconstitute their national home in what was known as the Land of Israel for 3,000 years, the capital of which was Jerusalem. Now that framework was preserved by Article 80 of the UN Charter.
The Six-Day War of 1967 left Israel in control of 3 times as much territory as she had before the war, including all of the territory that the San Remo resolution intended for the Jewish homeland that lay west of the Jordan River, plus more. Almost immediately after the war, Israel declared its sovereignty over its historic capital city, particularly the Old City, and extended full civil jurisdiction over the whole of Jerusalem.
Part of the confusion has come about because In 1967, when Israel took back control, the question was asked, is this occupied territory or not? Okay, does the law of belligerent occupation apply? Israel itself took the position, on the basis of legal advice to the government of the day, that yes, there are arguments, strong arguments, that this is occupied territory, or at least part of it.
A state, if it wants to, even though it's not required to apply the rules of belligerent occupation, may apply them to any territory it wants, including its own territory. And the outstanding example here is the United States after the Civil War. The United States government decided to apply the rules of belligerent occupation to all the southern states, pending the meeting of several conditions. And this was not the United States giving up its claim to sovereignty. This was not, in fact, compromising in any way its claim to sovereignty, nor was the United States claiming that it was required to do so. It simply did so as a matter of choice.
Israel immediately took steps, with the Knesset passing the Law and Administration Ordinance Amendment number 11, to extend its law, administration and jurisdiction over the whole of Jerusalem, using the terminology areas formerly part of mandatory Palestine. And in July 1967, the then Foreign Minister Abba Eban informed the UN Secretary General in writing that these acts did not constitute annexation. And that is significant because the term annexation is fundamentally misconceived with respect to Israel's actions in any part of what was formerly Mandate territory. No state can annex what is already their own sovereign territory. The temporary administration framework that Israel adopted in the West Bank at that point seeks to keep all options open.
With the repossessed territory, Israel had also inherited an Arab population of more than 1 million people, which concerned Israeli leaders. The government of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol stated their readiness to hand over much of the territory gained in the war if the Arab states finally agreed to end their 20-year jihad against the Jewish state and recognise her right to exist in peace. In September 1967, the defeated Arab leaders met in Sudan and vowed that they would not negotiate, they would not recognise, and they would not make peace with the Zionist enemy. In the next episode of Whose Land, we examine UN Security Council Resolution 242 following Israel's victory in 1967. What does it really mean for the Jewish state and the status of Jerusalem?